Today's lesson is on the White House. So this is going to be kind of like a tour of the building, what it is, what the rooms are, some of the interesting things that have happened there, and so forth. So the White House includes 6 stories and 55,000 square feet of floor space. You don't need to memorize all of that, but just to give you a general idea. It has 132 rooms, 35 bathrooms, 412 doors, 147 windows, 28 fireplaces, 8 staircases, 3 elevators, 5 full-time chefs. It has a tennis court, on the grounds, a bowling alley, a movie theater, a jogging track, a swimming pool, or at least it did, and a putting green. The original residence is in the center, so the executive residence there. There are 2 colonnades, one in the east and one in the west, that were designed by Thomas Jefferson, and they now connect the executive residence with the east wing and the west wing that were added later. So the executive residence is the part that most people think of when they think of the White House, and that's where the family, the first family, lives, and that's where a lot of the ceremonial functions and ceremonies and official entertaining take place. A lot of the work actually takes place in the west wing and the east wing, which we're adding here. So it was originally called the President's House or the Executive Mansion or things like that. It was planned by Charles L'Enfant in 1791 as part of his plan for Washington, D.C. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State, agreed that the design for the White House and the Capitol would be chosen in a competition, a design competition. Lots of entries were given, and Washington personally selected a drawing for the White House that was submitted by an Irish architect, Irish-American, Irish-born, named James Hoban. Jefferson anonymously submitted a design for the White House, but Washington chose Hoban's over Jefferson's. And Hoban modeled the White House on a building called Leinster House in Dublin, which today is the building for the Irish legislature. And you can see the Irish building, and I think if you look at the 4 columns there, you can kind of see the similarity that people see in the design and the inspiration. So construction took place between 1792 and 1800, and it was done in a neoclassical style. So if I were to ask you a trivia question, probably won't, but if I were to say, name the one American president who never slept in the White House, who would it be? Think logically. There you go. Yeah. He was busy helping to pick it and design it, right? And it was being built. It wasn't finished until he was dead, actually. He had already left office and passed away before it was ever finished. So the only president who never slept there was George Washington. So one of the major events in the history of the White House was the burning of Washington. This took place during the War of 1812. It took place in 1814. The British Army captured Washington, D.C. They burned the Capitol, where Congress meets, and they burned the White House. And much of the interior and exterior was destroyed, and so it basically had to be rebuilt. Just as a trivia point, the earliest evidence we have of it being called the White House is in 1811. And that disproves a myth. There was a popular myth that after the British burned it, it was painted white to cover up the charring, and then it became nicknamed the White House. But that nickname actually came up before the burning, so that can't be the explanation. It was officially called the Executive Mansion for many, many years, all the way up until Theodore Roosevelt. President Roosevelt, in the early 1900s, in 1901, began using the term White House and the official stationery. So all the letters and correspondence going from the White House called it the White House instead of Executive Mansion for the first time. And obviously the name stuck, and we just don't call it Executive Mansion anymore. So President Roosevelt is also the president who really relocated all of the work offices to the West Wing. You can see here a picture of the West Wing shortly after it was completed in 1901. And because there was just becoming so much work to do, the Executive Mansion was overcrowded, and so President Roosevelt moved all of the work to the offices in the West Wing, where they are today. The Oval Office, which I'll show you pictures of later and is very famous, is in the West Wing. It was created under President Taft in 1909. The East Wing, this picture is from 1906, was initially used as a reception area for social events. It was updated and altered in 1946. An office space was created in the East Wing, so work is done there as well today. Now, by 1948, President Harry Truman was in office, and the house was in very bad condition. Its exterior walls and internal wood beams were considered close to collapse. So, under Truman, the interior rooms were completely dismantled. You can see they basically gutted the White House, the Executive Mansion, and a new steel frame was constructed. The Truman balcony was added. I don't think I have a picture specifically of the Truman balcony. I should find one. And then the interior rooms were rebuilt. And that's kind of an interesting and to me somewhat sad thing. So all of the interior had to be gutted and rebuilt, which means the actual floors that Washington and Lincoln and Jefferson walked on are mostly gone, right? Because they had to be rebuilt after this reconstruction. So here you see a view of the White House complex from the north. So, and you can see the two wings and so forth. In September 1961, Congress declared the White House a museum. That means furniture, fixtures, and decorative arts could be declared either historic or of artistic interest by the president, and this prevents them from being sold, which happened before then. Many of the objects in the Executive Mansion had been sold off in the previous 150 years and lost. So now, when these objects are not in use or on display at the White House, they are turned over to the Smithsonian Institution for preservation, study, storage, or exhibition. The executive residence that you see here in the center has 6 stories, a ground floor, state floor, second floor, and third floor, and a 2-story basement. And the property is owned by the National Heritage Site. It is a National Heritage Site. It is owned by the National Park Service. So now I want to give you a little tour of the White House. So the ground floor, or the White House complex, I'm going to talk about the East and West Wing a little bit as well. So the ground floor is made up of the diplomatic reception room, the map room, the china room, the vermeil room, the library, the main kitchen, and other offices. The diplomatic reception room is one of 3 oval rooms in the executive residence of the White House. It is located on the ground floor and is used as an entrance from the South Lawn and a reception room for foreign ambassadors. The room is the point of entry to the White House for a visiting head of state following the state arrival room on the South Lawn. Here you can see President Reagan meeting the Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. This would have been around 1987 or so. And you can see there was a panoramic painting along one big wall of the reception room. The map room got this name because during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt used it as a situation room where they literally had maps to instruct, to track the progress of World War II. And now they use the situation room in the West Wing for that, so they don't need it for that kind of purpose anymore. Today it's used for television interviews, small teas, and social gatherings. So today it looks like this. It's just a regular old meeting room, but in the old days, during World War II, this is where Roosevelt actually sat with his advisors and talked about the course of World War II as it was going on. The China Room. So this is used to display the White House's collection of state china. The collection ranges from George Washington's Chinese export china to Barack Obama's, well, I don't have a picture of his collection. I should have. But Barack Obama has a collection there too. Traditionally, most presidents pick a china set or have a china set designed for them, and it's used during official gatherings during their presidency, and then it's stored here in this room. This, I think, is one of the prettiest and most interesting of the rooms. It's called the Vermeil Room. And I think what makes it so interesting is that there are portraits of different first ladies hanging in the room. So the one on the left is Lady Bird Johnson. Her husband was President LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in the 1960s. She was a Texan. She was from the Austin area. So you see a lot of things named after her over in that area. On the right, of course, is Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. She was JFK's wife when he was president in the early 1960s. And there are there are like 5 or 6 really nice portraits of first ladies hanging in the Vermeil Room. The White House Library is also on the ground floor. It's used for meetings and teas hosted by the President and the First Lady. One little bit of kind of trivia about this room is interesting. When they were reconstructing the White House in the 1950s, they salvaged some of the original lumber and they remade it into the wall paneling in this room. So the walls of this room are literally all that's left of the original lumber from the White House, almost 2 centuries ago. So next we have the state floor. So the state floor of the residence includes the East Room, Green Room, Blue Room, Red Room, State Dining Room, Family Dining Room, Cross Hall, Entrance Hall, and Grand Staircase. Here you can see the East Room. This is a very important room. Lots of historic events have happened here. Swearing in of cabinet members, justices of the Supreme Court. There have been important press conferences. The signing of legislation often takes place in the East Room. And there are receptions here for foreign dignitaries. There are dances and ceremonies and concerts, etc. The Kennedys, and the picture on the left shows what the East Room looked like during the Kennedy administration, often provided entertainment in the East Room. Another important use for the East Room is that historically many funerals or funerary events have taken place in the East Room. Here you see a drawing of Lincoln, the funeral in the East Room. And you can get an idea of the room's fairly big size, all the people packed in there. So William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, William McKinney, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, all had funerals or something, related to their funerals in the East Room. Of the 8 presidents who have died in office, only one of them didn't lie in state or have a funeral in the East Room. That was Garfield. President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the East Room. You can see lots of people gathered there, including Martin Luther King over here, to witness the signing of one of the most important laws in American history. In 1978, President Carter signed with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, the Camp David Accords. This was a historic treaty between Israel and Egypt, and basically Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist for the first time in history. And to this day, Egypt is one of the few Middle Eastern countries that recognizes Israel's right to exist. Another major event, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, in 1987 in the East Room. This was a major treaty reducing nuclear weapons, and this was a major event in ending the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Another fascinating room is the Green Room. Well, I think it's a pretty room. I don't know if it's fascinating, but it's used for small receptions, for teas. But during a state dinner, they serve cocktails, and obviously it gets its name because it is traditionally decorated in green. The Blue Room gets its name because it's typically decorated in blue. It is distinct because it has an oval shape, one of the three oval-shaped rooms in the White House. It's used for receptions, small dinners. It was the site, the place, for the only wedding of a president and first lady in the White House. President Grover Cleveland married Frances Folsom in 1886, and the ceremony took place in the Blue Room. The Red Room, again, named after the predominant color. It's been a parlor, a music room. Presidents have had small dinner parties in it. And here Reagan is meeting with Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The State Dining Room is used for receptions, luncheons, large formal dinners, and state dinners for visiting heads of state on state visits. It's one of the larger rooms in the White House, maybe the largest. So if you hear of the President of Mexico or the Prime Minister of Canada coming to have a state dinner, this is an official ceremony, and they are going to have their dinner in the state room here. And it's a very formal gathering. So the family dining room is located on the state floor of the White House. It's used for smaller, more private meals. So if you are invited to have dinner with the president, but you're not the King of England or the President of Mexico, you might be eating dinner in this smaller room where the gathering would be more intimate. In the 1800s, this is where the president and his family actually ate their meals. But in the 20th century, in the last 100 years or so, the family actually usually eats its meals on the second floor, higher up than this. This is the Cross Hall. It's a broad hallway in the first floor in the White House. It runs east to west. It connects the state dining room with the East Room. And it measures 80 feet long. And you will often see pictures, I don't think I have one here, but you will often see pictures of presidents and their guests, whether it's presidents and prime ministers from other countries or kings and queens from other countries. They'll take pictures of them as they walk from the state room where they had dinner to the East Room where they're going to have entertainment, and they'll walk along this cross hall. The entrance hall, also called the Grand Foyer, is the primary and formal entrance to the White House. One interesting thing about this, 200 years ago, Jefferson used this hall as a cabinet of natural history to display the finds from the Lewis and Clark expedition. So they came back, Lewis and Clark explored the Louisiana Territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they came back with hundreds, maybe thousands of animals that they had stuffed and brought back as exhibits, and plants and drawings and other things they collected on their trip. And Jefferson exhibited them like a museum here in the entrance hall. In the 20th century, it's been used for official welcomes, receiving lines, concerts, dancing. John Travolta, back when he was a big star, danced with Princess Diana in 1985. The Czech president, Václav Havel, visited the White House in 1998 and danced with First Lady Hillary Clinton during his visit. This is the grand staircase. It connects the state floor to the second floor. And they sometimes have a ceremonial entry called the Presidential Entrance March. So everybody else will be down on the state floor, and the president will enter from the second floor to music and so forth. So the second floor is the residential floor. You have the yellow oval room, sitting halls, the master bedroom, the president's dining room, the treaty room, the Lincoln bedroom, the Queen's bedroom, and other places. The yellow oval room was used as a drawing room in the John Adams administration, and it has been used as a library, an office, and a family parlor. Today it's used for small receptions and to greet heads of state before a state dinner. The East Sitting Hall is also on the second floor. It's used as a reception room for guests of the president. It's also used as a family parlor. In other words, just a place where the family can hang out. The West Sitting Hall is used as something like a living room for the first families. Of course, Biden's in his late 70s. I don't think he has many kids around, but to whatever extent he and his wife and their children need a living room, this serves as something like that kind of a function. The White House master bedroom, or the president's bedroom, is currently used mostly as a living room. In the old days, like 50 years ago, it was common for the president and the first lady to have separate bedrooms. And so this was literally the president's bedroom. But starting in the 1970s, the president and the first lady began to share a bedroom, and this became more of a living room. So when President Lincoln was around in the 1860s, this would have been where he slept. Not the room that's called the Lincoln bedroom, which got his name, but he never slept there. So the president's dining room is on the second floor, and it is connected to the main kitchen by a dumbwaiter, which is there's a little opening here, and there's like a tray that goes up and down so they can be served directly from the main kitchen. This room, I think, is one of the most interesting and historic rooms in the White House. It's called the Treaty Room. And this desk is called the Resolute Desk. And it's now in the vice president's office, but it's a desk that dates back to President Theodore Roosevelt, and it's been used by vice presidents ever since him, if I remember correctly. So this treaty room has been the scene of a lot of historic events in the nation's history. President Bush used this on October 7, 2001 to announce the beginning of the war in Afghanistan. 20 years later, President Joe Biden used this room to announce that the United States would be withdrawing all of its soldiers from Afghanistan. And President Obama used this room as office space and did a lot of work from here. The Lincoln bedroom is famous. It's named after President Lincoln, but he used this room as an office, not as a bedroom. Now it's a bedroom for guests, and it's often seen as a real privilege to be allowed to spend the night in the Lincoln bedroom. The Queen's bedroom is another bedroom for guests. It is named after the Queen of England, I think, who visited here. Winston Churchill also stayed in this room. President Eisenhower's son, John, and his wife stayed in this room for a while, but Mamie Eisenhower, the First Lady, made them leave because it was named the Queen's bedroom. She thought it was improper for anyone who wasn't a queen or a prime minister to stay. It used to be called the Rose Room, but it's been called the Queen's bedroom since at least 1963. Now, that was the residential area. Now I want to focus a little bit on the part of the White House complex where most of the work really gets done. This is the West Wing. So when you see the president speaking from the Oval Office, this is where he is. He's not in the residential part of the White House that you see on pictures all the time. He has walked to work, basically, and is working out of the Oval Office. And this is what the Oval Office looks like. So it's the formal working space for the president. It's part of the West Wing. And it's an oval-shaped room. It has 3 large windows facing south behind the president's desk. And it has a fireplace at the north end, so we can't see it because it's at the part where, from our viewpoint. It has 2 built-in bookcases, 4 doors. The east door opens to the Rose Garden, so that way. And the west door leads to a private study and dining room. The northeast door to the president's secretariat, and another door to a corridor in the West Wing. There have been lots of historic moments and images from the West Wing. John F. Kennedy Jr. was President Kennedy's son. Someone snapped a picture of him playing underneath the desk while his dad was at work. Other great moments when President Nixon spoke by telephone to astronauts on the moon. He did so from the Oval Office. And other presidents, when Nixon resigned in 1974, he spoke to the nation from the Oval Office. When George W. Bush spoke to the country after the September 11 attacks in 2001, he spoke from the Oval Office. So many times when presidents have wanted to address the nation, they do so from this room. This is the cabinet room. This is another very important room. It adjoins the Oval Office, so the president can walk straight from his office into this room. And here is where he can meet all of his cabinet members. These are the officials and the advisors to the president. And this room looks out over the Rose Garden. This is the Situation Room. I told you earlier that in World War II, President Roosevelt had a map room in the White House. And literally, they had maps hanging up everywhere, and they could talk about World War II as they got information from their generals and whatever. Nowadays, that sort of stuff happens here in the Situation Room. Here is where the president can follow, literally, wars being fought overseas as they happen, and can communicate with generals around the world and so forth. So this room is a 5,524 square foot conference room. That means the room is bigger than twice the size of most houses. And it's run by the National Security Council. It's used by the president and his advisors to deal with crises at home and abroad. Here you see just a couple of pictures. On the left, you see President Johnson. This is during the Vietnam War. And he's looking at a model of a part of Vietnam called Khe Sanh, where a battle was going on in 1968. On the right, you see President Reagan, and they're talking about Libya in 1986, when Libya was a terrorist country and kind of an enemy of the United States. More pictures. On the left, you see President Bush, George W. Bush. This is in 2003, and they're talking about the Iraq War. And then on the right, this is 2011, and you see President Obama, Vice President Biden, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and there are many other advisors and officials around them. And what they're watching is the operation that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in 2011. Okay, the James Brady Press Briefing Room was named after a man who was shot and paralyzed during an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. He was a member of the media. So this is in the West Wing, and this is where the press secretary gives briefings to the media. So if you ever see in the news, the White House press secretary represents the president, and almost every day, at least during the week, Monday through Friday, the press secretary gives updates to the media, and they ask him or her, currently it's a woman, they ask her questions. And this is where all that takes place. You can see the cameras and everything. Every once in a while, the president himself will pop in, will come out from behind there and take a few questions himself, but usually it's the press secretary dealing with it on behalf of the president. So here you can see again the model a little bit. So the Oval Office here, the president's secretary here. Here's the cabinet room where they can meet with the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury. Typically, the president will meet with all of the cabinet members, like once a week or so, and get updates all at the same time. And then here's the press briefing room. So the president can just walk down there if he wants to and address the press. It doesn't happen too often, but it can. Often the Rose Garden is another place where they'll have ceremonies. On a nice day, they might swear somebody in or have a press conference out here in the Rose Garden. So that is often done as well. So the Roosevelt Room is another room in the West Wing. It's a large meeting room. It's named after Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt. It's used for staff meetings, and it has become common to use it for announcements, for announcing appointments, nominations. And sometimes when large groups of people are going to meet the president in the Oval Office, they will sort of sit here until it's time for them to go in. But you can see here a picture of President Obama having a meeting in the Roosevelt Room. So it's often used for meetings with the president.